we will need to really, as has been said by Professor Sachs, we need to invest in the future. And investing in the future means that we need to invest in infrastructure and human capital. That will be key. We need to make sure that what we are investing in is actually yielding higher rates of returns. Because for this to be sustainable, it needs to be bringing rates of returns to these investments that are higher than the cost at which we're borrowing. And we'll come to that cost of borrowing in a little bit. And then we definitely need, going forward, it needs to be private sector led, because there is a limit to what the state can do. The levels of growth that we need to be really kind of, empowered by the private sector, led by the private sector, and the role of the government will be to provide the enabling environment to do that, providing the infrastructure, providing, the good business environment, the, stable regulatory environment. That will be really essential. And of course, on the issues, one of the key issues that many of the African countries will need to focus on is economic diversification. Really key, going beyond the, what has historically been the case of too much, focus on primary commodities, and the need to diversify and really reduce this very high level of exposure and vulnerability to global price shocks. And here when we're talking about economic diversification, it's no longer, just the old model. Now we need to think of services as a key component of economic diversification in this day and age. Really investing in, the services sectors and sectors of the future, where actually, a part of the paradigm will be kind of almost rethinking also the industrialization, the future of industrialization. What worked in China and Korea is not going to be what works for the African countries now. China was built on the idea of the low-cost labor. With the, advances in technology, this is not going to be the edge for Africa. Okay, this can be done by, robots and other technological advances. We need to find our niche. It's going to be a different model. We can learn from the previous experiences in terms of what helped. We need to think of how do we develop around our endowment, and then how do we think of the future? Where the world is moving, how do we leverage technology to leapfrog our development? Another very important area that has been mentioned is the issue of cost of capital. So, of course, we all agree that for the level of growth that we're talking about we need much higher level of financing. But first, let's take a stock of reality. At the current time, with the hike in interest rates by major developed central banks, we are turning into a new norm in access to international markets. So the levels of very low interest rates that the world, including African countries, have enjoyed following the financial crisis and quantitative easing, we're not going to see that anytime soon. What does this mean? It means that going forward, it's going to be much harder for African countries to get finance, but also much more expensive. And if you add that to the fact that even in good times, Africa had to pay a premium, an Africa premium of 100 to 270 basis points to borrow in international markets compared to other countries with the same type or similar fundamentals. So that with the current realities of much higher will make it, unaffordable for African countries to have, access, many African countries to have access to international markets. And this will be a constraint. And that's why it's very important, and that's what we're working on now with ministers of finance, to really look into the issues of reforming the global financial architecture. And, there is a high-level working group that is composed of the African Ministers of Finance, which ECA serves as the secretariat. It includes also the African Union, African Development Bank, IMF, World Bank, Afrexim Bank, and it has been discussing what is needed to actually reform the system. Because basically, for this development and these needs to be tenable, that cost needs to be reduced. And that can be done through things like, looking at issues of, de-risking, basically having some sort of guarantees, perhaps for things like green finance to lower the cost of access to market. So we need to think of new paradigms to actually make these needs, available, to actually avail more resources. And there are a number of areas that are needed there, because also the reality is when the cost of borrowing is very high for countries, it's even higher for the private sector. So what does this mean? It's really impeding not only for the government to finance its budget, but it's also impeding the private sector to play a larger role. So here becomes the issue of the need to really have more blended finance, so the private sector can actually have access to cheaper finance, the need to have more guarantees, the need to have credit enhancement tools, and to really improve the system, the global debt system, making it, making, for example, the G20 common framework more efficient, to function, smoothly, to actually allow a standstill of debt service at application for countries, to allow to actually also other countries like, middle-income countries to access that, to look into these issues in an orderly manner. It needs to really, we need to move from the common framework being uncommon to actually being a common framework.
Let me request you to go towards summarizing. I'm
Sure.
reminded we have to go for a press conference soon.
Sure.
Okay.
So basically, we need to also improve for the debt market, we need to ensure that there are clauses that allows actually smoother restructuring, force majeure clauses. And we also need basically for the existing tools, currently for the international system, the existing tools to help countries were designed for country-specific shock. We've moved beyond this. What we've seen over the last few years are tsunami of global shocks. So the toolkits of international financial institutions need to adapt to that, to be able to provide funding when it's beyond the policy decisions or idiosyncratic shocks that are facing countries. And that's why it's important, for example, at the IMF to increase emergency financing, to extend emergency financing facilities for things like the war in Ukraine, to increase the access limits for countries so that they are able to actually borrow when they are faced with shocks, and to remove the type of surcharges that many middle-income countries, actually 4 countries in Africa, middle-income countries in Africa, are faced with that when they have high financing needs because of the global shocks. So we need to look at all these issues to really reform the system and the ability to access. Another very important issue would also be for market access, would be the ability to actually reform the governance for the credit rating agencies. Currently, if Angola is rated, for example, by a credit agency, and they don't agree with that rating, the only way that they can do is go through the internal system of that international rating company. There is no oversight body, international oversight body, independent one, that regulates that. This is something that has to be looked at. It has been looked at after the European crisis for Europe, and they instituted a system by which this can be done. We need something similar, and then we need to make sure that the channeling of SDR is functioning and utilized in development through MDBs. Thank you.